Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Matthew with my co-host Matt, or Matt with my co-host Matthew. So today, I directed my co-host's attention to a YouTube video, or actually a live stream that the YouTuber The Amazing Atheist put out a few days ago. And it was titled, My Left or Your Left? And we're going to try not to, do the he said, she said sort of commentary. But I just thought it was a good jumping off point because he talks about a lot in that video, and it's a general, I guess you could say there's some drama going on in leftist circles on the internet right now. I hate that word, but I'm using it anyway. So if you guys don't know, there's a show called Rising, which is put out by The Hill, and the two people that host it are Crystal Ball and Sager and Jetty. They've come out with a book titled "The Populist's Guide to 2020: A New Right and New Left Are Rising." I haven't read the book, but from what I've read about it, basically it's it makes the argument that, the populist right and the populist left have more in common than they have more commonalities than disagreements, and that we should, form a coalition, that those people should form a coalition to get past the policies and legislation in common that they want passed. And of course, that's also the point of their show. Crystal Ball is a progressive or a liberal, and a Bernie supporter, and Sager and Jetty is a conservative and a Trump supporter. So I'm kind of just going to go through a little bit of what the Amazing Atheist said, just kind of some of the background he mentions. There was an article. So in response to this book that Ball and Jetty released, a man by the name of Nathan J. Robinson released an article in Current Affairs on the Current Affairs website titled, "Isn't right-wing populism just fascism?" And I'm tempted just to leave that, just not even to say anything about that, because that title itself just rings alarm bells in my head. Anyone who might be slightly right-wing, they're automatically a fascist. And then, okay, okay, but that's fine. That's a title page. A lot of people use clickbaity titles, whatever. And I'm just going to read like the first couple sentences. Let us ask a question. Who are some famous right-wing populists? Well, let's see. Historically, Hitler and Mussolini can be categorized as right-wing populists. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. It took him two sentences to throw out the Hitler Mussolini smear. Now, and I should have liked this guy's article, because he even says, I'm a socialist. But I really didn't like the article. I thought it was poorly argued. It was he was basically making the argument that the Rising is a bad show, that this book they put out is a bad book. The populist left and the populist right really don't have much in common. So, Crystal Ball is wrong to be hosting a TV show with a conservative, and she's wrong to put out a book with a conservative. And of course, one thing that's interesting to me is I actually didn't know about this show Rising until fairly recently, but it's actually very similar to our show in some respects. You and I aren't a liberal versus a conservative respectively, but we're two people who come to different conclusions about current events, and we come together and we try to talk about it, and we see, if maybe we can come to any common ground, or, what issues we just completely disagree on and we'll never agree on. But You see, I guess the question really is there such a thing as right-wing populism, or not? And I'll just read a quick definition. If you just Google populism, the Google says the definition is a person, especially a politician, who strives to appeal to ordinary. That's the definition of a populist: a person, especially a politician, who strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. But you can expand that definition to the ideology itself. I think right-wing populism is a thing, and I suppose a good way to think about it is Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump aren't far off economically. They both railed against the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal that Obama and other Democrats and Republicans wanted to get passed. They rail against corporations sending U.S. jobs overseas. They are both fairly protectionist in their trade. So I think there is such a thing as right-wing populism, and I think that not to acknowledge that is silly. And if you agree with someone on a particular issue, then you can work with them, even if you disagree with them on social issues, which probably would be the distinction. Left-wing populists are more liberal on social issues, and right-wing populists are more conservative on social issues. I'll let Matt jump in here.
So you said a lot there, and I'm going to respond to certain parts of it and just go on a couple other small tangents. One, I like how you mentioned that Rising is kind of the inverse of our show. They just agree on economic issues, and we kind of agree on social issues, but not economic issues. So I liked how that ties into what we do a little bit. So I generally am in discussion circles that are more about people who want to use the state as a tool versus people who hate the state, right? So when I branched into this conversation, it was really interesting because I kind of had to go in there and separate the different flavors of statism in my mind. But it's like, okay, well, here's populism, but what's the difference between the populists and the people who are generally thought of stereotypically as elites? And then if you break down the populists, what are the different flavors of that and why? And that was kind of an interesting exercise in thought because I don't even normally feel the need to parse that. So overall, the whole debate of should right and left-wing populists work together, I find kind of compelling because it's kind of half the discussion's about should we platform the other side, and half of it is what is real populism, almost, right? Because some of the left-wing populists just don't really think the views of the right-wing populists are legitimate. So I guess an example of that would be when they start talking about maybe people on the right-wing populist side potentially being xenophobic for different reasons. And then you can talk about overlap with, well, some left-wing populists are more closed borders, but it's, for a different reason than the right-wing populists. So I don't know if you really came around to your conclusion there in your kind of opening monologue. But I think I think there should be a moderate position here. And I don't think it's a very complex moderate position. It should just be, well, the times that you clearly are in line on the issue and the solution, then you should agree with them. But I think the animal of United States politics is what ends up blurring it. I mean, at one point in the video itself, they talked about how a lot of right-wing people were run as right-wing populists. And then they get in office, and then they do things that populists don't typically agree with. And it's because they abandoned what they ran on to join the typical party lines, right? So how much consensus can there really be in those situations? But with that said, I think it's pretty obvious that the Republican Party is not the Tea Party right now, right? Because Donald Trump has tried to do infrastructure week once a month the whole time he's been a president because he wants to do a big stimulus bill for infrastructure. And that's not something the Tea Party would have been in favor of. So do you kind of want to delve into what you perceive as maybe some of the sticking points where they don't agree as much, the right and the left-wing populists, and then maybe we can dive into those topics?
Yeah, of course. And just to be clear, I think I said this in the monologue, but just so we're on the same page, I completely agree with you. If if I were a politician and there was a right-wing populist that I agreed with, on economic issues, I would work with that person on economic issues, and um, I wouldn't refuse to not work. I would not refuse to work with them just because they don't agree with me 100% of the time. Um, I would also not, if I had some, media platform, I would not refuse to platform them just because they disagree with me. They don't agree with me 100% of the time. We don't live. I think this is something that Crystal Ball kind of mentioned in her response to Nathan J. Robinson's article. We live in a messy world. You can't, especially with politics. Sometimes you have to work with certain people that maybe you disagree with on this issue, but you really agree on that issue. And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean you're not. That doesn't mean you're not a true, conservative or liberal or leftist or whatever. Because, and this is actually a point that Kyle Kalinske made. Because the Amazing Atheist, there's a lot of people he talks about in this conversation because a lot of people weighed in. But Kyle Kalinske says, it doesn't go. This moral purity test doesn't go the other way around. It seems so. There's a lot of people. Most people wouldn't say that we can't or more that people who consider themselves radical leftists or socialists or whatever. They wouldn't say we can't work with Joe Biden on climate change, for example. But for some reason, when it's a right winger, oh no, we can't work with him ever just because we don't like his position on immigration. But to get to your question, I do think a lot of it comes down to economic issues versus social issues. So I mentioned in my opening that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump agree a lot on economic issues. And, I would go so far as to say that the best thing that Donald Trump ever did was to prevent the TPP from signing into law. Now, you could, if you want to go into a little, if you want to explain to me, why that was a bad idea, I'm open to it, but that's my opinion. And I'm just because I disagree with Donald Trump on pretty much everything else doesn't mean I'm going to say, well, I can't respect him or even applaud him for doing that. But of course, at least when Trump decided to enter politics, he became more conservative on issues of immigration and climate change and abortion. Now, and another person that the current affairs article brings up is Tucker Carlson. I really dislike this article. I don't know if I'm making myself clear enough on that front. I mean, he's smearing pretty much everybody, and he smears Tucker Carlson as a racist, as someone who doesn't want to listen to other viewpoints, as a fake populist. Now, when it comes to someone like Tucker Carlson, he actually, in an interview with the show Q&A on C-SPAN, he said to the interviewer, "I'm not a populist, I'm an elitist." So, okay, I believe him. if that's what he feels like, or if that's how he's going to express himself, I believe him. But that doesn't mean that Tucker Carlson doesn't occasionally veer in the populist direction, because I think he does, even if generally speaking he doesn't consider himself a populist. He's against, outsourcing U.S. jobs to other countries. And, someone like, I would be willing to work with someone, and I can even respect someone like Tucker Carlson. I can even respect the Tea Party. And now I've changed my position on that. I used to despise the Tea Party. I used to really think the Tea Party was just a bunch of crazy lunatics. But I started to think about it more, and I realized that, there are legitimate reasons to be to follow the Tea Party. There are some arguments from the Tea Party that I think are legitimate arguments. There are voices from the Tea Party that I think are voices that need to be heard and or at least answered, or their questions need to be answered. So I do think I'm just reiterating there can be a united front as such, or there can be a coalition. But yeah, that's I guess I hope I got my distinction of what I think right versus left wing populism is.
Yeah, and I think you explained that pretty well. So one of the things that the Amazing Atheist talked about at some points was being able to diagnose a problem isn't good enough, right? So one of the before we had this talk, one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to look at the definition of populism, just because I'm like hearing all these things that are very different, but they're still classified as it, and it's generally taking the side of the the workers, I guess you can put in quotes, against the elites, right? That's like the most base level. That's what populism is. So no wonder there's so many splits, and that's why you can have so many different people calling them populists, even if they don't agree. Now, when there's overlap, you should agree, and that's why somebody like me, who has a very ANCAP bend, I'm okay with siding with people who are completely different than me on particular issues. Like when I hear that certain statists want to do something that ends up happening to coincidentally line up with my policy prescriptions, then I take it as a win, even though I don't really agree with them on 90% of the thing. That kind of ties into what we were saying about Black Lives Matter. Like, I'm not one to glorify cops, and I think that they're saying a lot of things for the wrong reasons. But hey, if we're going to make police brutality or if we're going to make that less prevalent, like, that's a win, even if I don't agree with a lot of their messaging or a lot of the other policies they strive for. So I'm willing to cede that there is something to gain from that. So if I was a left-wing populist, and then Tucker Carlson's on the right wing and he's pushing against trade deals that I also don't want to happen, then it's like, well, if Tucker Carlson can get 40% of the Republican Fox News base to agree with me on this trade issue, then I think you should take that as a win. And you don't have to take the xenophobia with his economics, right? If you think he's doing certain imaging about, views on certain my minority groups, and you find that abhorrent, it's like, well, then call that out. But you can play balls and strikes with anybody. You can hear their whole hour-long lecture and spiel of their views, and you can take the 15 minutes you like and say, hey, on this quarter, I'll agree with you. 3 quarters, I'll disagree. But let's try to work where we can work. Now, one of the problems with modern American politics is every bill that they pass is 400 pages long. And you can't just... So one of the criticisms I could see a left-wing pure populist saying is, okay, you get some right-wing populists in there, but we're only going to be able to bring together these two groups to agree on certain things if we cede other things that we don't want to cede, because everything's a bundled package, right? So having a right-wing populist in there might not be that great, because to get a bill passed about trade, you also have to add in 4 other horses that are things that you don't want to pass. But I think that's just the nature of politics. But that's why I think the purity test is so important. The other thing is people are rarely held accountable to what they run on. So you can imagine a candidate runs on some things that are populist, and then they get in office, and then they don't use that as part of their agenda at all. And I think that's why a lot of people who are fans of Bernie Sanders were really skeptical about Hillary Clinton, right? Is because she adopted a lot of his, she adopted a lot of his issues once he dropped out. But it's like, well, how much does she really believe that? Because I think she's a neoliberal that's going to push her neoliberal ideology and isn't really going to fight for the workers. She's just paying us lip service. That doesn't mean anything. Right. And I can see the case for feeling that way, even though you could easily argue that she's a better pick in terms of there's some overlap than, say, another random person. So it is kind of a thought-provoking argument, because you have to, once you're talking about the politicians involved, you do have to kind of think more, you have to think beyond the philosophy and their actual spoken views and think of, in practice, in our weird system, how would the game theory game out? And it could end up being certain views it doesn't matter if they're paid lip service to. That's everything that was with the Republicans in 2008 about shrinking government. None of that panned out for a reason, right? And it's because once they got in there, they said, but what we really care about is the military, and all the liberals don't want us to slash the budget. And in our hearts, all we care about is the military. So we'll grow all the government and grow the military. And that's how we are where we are today. At least that's my perception of it, which you don't have to adopt. So yeah, do you want to build off that? Do you want
to? I guess what I'd like to insert here, and so I've just conceded that I think the Tea Party is a legitimate movement, even if I disagree with aspects of it. And so I would like to mention here that I think my populism allows me to understand why people are Trump supporters. And, you know, I've talked about how I think liberals often get Trump wrong or they take him too seriously. You know, they let themselves get wound up because he, you know, is intentionally trying to provoke people, or he says something dumb on Twitter or whatever. But, you know, I can, given my populism, I think there are a lot of right-wing populists that voted for Donald Trump. Now, I don't think Donald Trump is the best example of a right-wing populist. That doesn't mean he's Adolf Hitler. I just I just don't think he's the best example of right-wing populism, and he's just not. He's not really a political animal, as I've said before. He, you know, got into politics later, and just was kind of riding the wave. But, you know, Donald Trump was running on the platform that, you know, again, it's almost, I keep bringing up Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are similar, so I don't mean to keep repeating myself, but you know, Donald Trump was running on the platform that, well, you know, this system isn't working for Americans. It's supposed to be, this government system we have is supposed to be serving America's best interest, and it's not serving your best interest. But if you vote for me, I will make sure that it begins to serve your interest. And that's a powerful message, which I think is true. I mean, one of the reasons Trump won was because he was acknowledging some of the failings in our system, and Hillary Clinton was just kind of trying to pretend, you know, it's like she had seen the wizard behind the curtain, but she was pretending that the wizard wasn't there. She was trying to pretend like all these issues that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump brought up, that you know, they're not really there. And she paid some lip service to some of Bernie Sanders' ideas. That's true. But for the most part, I think she was just trying to ignore those problems. So, you know, I think another reason to not deplatform people and to have conversations with people you radically disagree with is you're able to better to understand their perspective. You know, and I'm not a Trump supporter, so I can't claim to know exactly how they feel, but I think I have a general idea of what they feel, and I respect their thought process to that extent. I could not vote for Donald Trump, but I can put myself in someone else's shoes and understand why someone would.
So one thing that in terms of thinking about candidates that run for public office that this makes me think of is I want to start a different thought and work my way there. So the person I'm going to lead with is Ron Paul, right? So Ron Paul's whole message, if you think of it as the average person versus the elite, is, if that's the definition of populism, Ron Paul ran on a populist message, because Ron Paul pretty much said, your whole life is yours. The government's getting in the way of it. It's elites that want to rule your life. The Federal Reserve is why the economy is crashing every decade. The Federal Reserve is the reason your money loses value, and it's the reason that you have to get invested in risky stocks, and that hurts you. And the reason why we want the reason we want inflation is because it helps big business and it helps these globalist elites. You know, Ron Paul's whole message, if you look at it in terms of elites versus, you know, people who seem subordinate to elites, is a populist message. And that's why when I was listening to these populists, I'm thinking like, well, if that's the simple definition of populist, I feel like I'm a populist, right? Because my whole thing is I hate elites, and that's why I hate the government. And that's why I don't want the government ruling over me. And I can make a populist argument for pretty much every single one of my viewpoints. Now, what I want to work towards in the terms of looking at things through a political lens and we're running for office is one of the reasons why people like Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton lose is because Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush ran for president on this idea of a continuation of the establishment, right? So Hillary Clinton's whole idea was you're going to get 4 more years of Obama, except even more milquetoast without charisma. And that's why Hillary Clinton dramatically failed. And then if you looked over at the Republican Party, like people like Marco Rubio were seen as these people who might overperform because, you know, he might be able to appeal to some Hispanic people. He might have this crossover appeal on, you know, the centrists that are afraid of Republicans. He can win them over. And it's like, in the end, he was taking the absolute standard establishment line for everything to the point where he got called out for being a robot on stage and repeating his talking point word for word like twice in the span of a minute or two. That was the whole Chris Christie making him malfunction in 2016, right? He was this establishment figure. So Trump over there talking off the hip, pretty much saying, no, everything's broken. You guys are all trash. You guys have been working here and you guys are doing a terrible job. Obviously, that's going to have appeal, even if his policy proposals are mostly different from even Bernie Sanders, because they do have some overlap. But yeah, you're right. In the whole point, the most overlap is in their stump speech of things are broken. It's not serving the people. I'm going to fix it. Now, that's why I understand the argument of just because you're a populist doesn't mean we should work with other populists. Because if one person's solution is to do this thing that I find destructive, and I don't think that's going to fix anything, then just because they're a populist doesn't mean we agree. Like I could argue pretty much every policy I stand on populist grounds. But that doesn't change the fact that I don't overlap with any of those economic populists that we talked about in those videos, right? So they shouldn't want to work with me if they really believe that those things help, because I don't agree with any of their positions. So I think that kind of adds some, I think that's a little bit, because I kind of switched into, here's my perception of it based on my views. Now, I do find that populist messaging very appealing, right? Because it makes it seem like you matter. It's not about the system to serve and protect you. It's about you're the individual. Things aren't going great for you. We're not serving you the best we can. So it goes beyond the status quo.
Well, I'm glad you actually brought that up brought up the Ron Paul, because, you know, I have some substantial agreements with Ron Paul and Rand Paul, and I would not be opposed to calling Ron Paul a populist. And I guess I would like to dive a little into maybe why I call myself a populist. I really didn't explain why. I just kind of said, you know, you can have both right-wing and left-wing populism. So because, you know, there's, and I guess I could say I can see both sides of that dichotomy to some extent. Like I mentioned how Tucker Carlson on C-SPAN said he wasn't a populist, and he said something to the effect of, well, populism is a sign of an unhealthy society. You know, therefore I'm an elitist. And he was saying, you know, well, if you have good elites, they say I'm for good elites, Tucker Carlson said. If you have good elites, that's what really matters. And yeah, I mean, I think everyone would say, yeah, sure, if we could actually have good elites, if we could actually have the best, you know, what aristocracy, I think, means rule by the best. And Plato thought that was the best form of government. Yeah, if they are actually the best, then yeah, of course we could say, you know, rule by elites, rule by an aristocracy, and so on. But this kind of goes back to an area where we disagree. That goes back to my democratic principles, democratic with a lowercase d. I strongly believe in democracy. I strongly believe in the right of the individual to have a say in legislation, in the economy, in, you know, have a say in his personal life. So I think that it's very rare, not impossible, and not it happens, but it's very rare, I think, for elites to become or a populist or take populist stances. Now, FDR was an elite, and I've called him one of my most favorite presidents. In fact, he was a corrupt elite. There was some scandal. I don't remember the exact scandal, but he was, I think, was it mayor of New York? And he was New York City or something, and he was got into some scandal there. So he was a corrupt elite, but he became a populist. And this might be a bad example, so I'll try to be careful when I say this, but Julius Caesar was also a populist, and he was murdered for being a populist. Now, I'm not saying I'm for autocratic rule by someone who calls himself a populist, but you could even say Napoleon, to some extent, was a populist, although that's a slightly different conversation. I just think quite often you're not going to get the elites who are going to say, yeah, we support, we're actually populist. I think, generally speaking, you're not going to get populist elites. And so I think I guess in some sense, I'm erring on the side of caution by saying, well, I'm a populist, therefore I'm against the elites. And I just think that populism as a whole does, it creates a more democratic society. And I would disagree with Carlson when he says it's a sign of unhealthy society. I would say it's a healthy response. You could almost say a healthy immune response to a society, even if a society isn't doing well. That's not necessarily populism's fault. Populism is the response to that.
Yeah, okay. I think there's a lot there, but I do appreciate a clarification on how you get to that position, right? One problem with the word populism, especially since 2016, it gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of like socialism, right? So people throw it around, and it's rarely defined in a narrow way. So people are often using it in ways that are not, similar. So people will use socialism to mean like any form of government control, and some use it to mean government owns all private property, right? So it's to some extent, when you quote people, you have to be careful that you're taking that into consideration. Because I think if you talked to Carlson and you said if we define populism as being against the elites, he might take a different stance than if you just primed him by talking about radical leftists for an hour on C-SPAN, right? So that's the only reason why I don't know if his self-diagnosis is as something I'd want to hang my hat on too much. The concept of aristocracy is something that I find very unappealing, because I don't think the problem with democracy is we pick the bad leaders. At this point, I'm kind of against leaders in general, right? So aristocracy is just a different way of getting there. And no matter how smart you are, I'm not convinced you can centrally plan, the world, because I don't think that's possible I guess there's two arguments why I don't find that particularly possible. But then we're getting into the whole socialist calculation problem. And I don't know if we want to delve into that right now. Which is just the idea of the one point that Mises would make is if you actually had essentially nationalized all resources, then you can't get true price levels. So you can't know what the average demand for a good is, because people don't have their money to decide what they want. So you'd kind of have to make your own estimates without any signals on what people actually want. Because money is the best way to actually expose people to a real skin in the game version of scarcity. So when people are actually faced with real scarcity and not them just kind of maybe filling out surveys or something, then you get this very genuine price signal. Ideally, it's very distorted for a lot of reasons. Then the other thing that Hayek would say is just you can't understand people's preferences unless you're in their head. And since you can't be in everybody's head, you can't really centralize something like consumer goods, right? Like, I don't think the government would come up with 8 different streaming services with all kinds of different genres of programming across several means, but the market can kind of figure that out, just based on a lot of stuff. So that's why, in general, like, one of the basic reasons why I'm against government, and that's without even bringing up me valuing freedom at all to some extent. That's just me talking why I think it's inherently going to fail, whether you have democracy or aristocracy. Now, one thing I kind of want to bring back to populism in general is I think it's impossible to derive specific policy positions from the idea of populism, because you're kind of assuming that everybody agrees with the outcome of your policy. So when we were listening to that leftist populist talk, he gave an example, or maybe it was when he was quoting Kuklinski, but it was an example of why a right-wing politician isn't a real populist. And one of the reasons is because he was against raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And one of my thoughts was, well, I don't see how that could make you not a populist unless everybody universally agrees on the outcomes of a $15 minimum wage. And based on my perception of those outcomes, I don't think you could be a populist and promote it, because, and I think that this is what drives to one of my criticisms of populism, and kind of with anything related to any philosophy based on the concept of the workers. I think a lot of policies end up favoring some workers over others. And I find that like a big problem. So when it comes to like the minimum wage, if you had a $15 minimum wage, you're going to price a lot of people out of the market because there isn't a company they can work for where they'd provide enough value to get hired at $15 an hour. Because there are some incredibly low skilled people. And a lot of them just don't work because they can't get a job if you drive wages up too much. They just aren't productive in an aspect to be able to warrant that wage. And I think a good example of this would be like you can imagine a lot of people working at a fast food restaurant, and some people are highly competent at their job and some people aren't. But imagine they all made $7 an hour. Well, if suddenly that's $15 an hour, their staffing requirements aren't inherently going to be stagnant, right? They aren't paying them the minimum because it's the minimum. I mean, to some extent they are. Some extent the wage floor does push it up for a lot of people. But the difference between hiring one person to maybe be a custodian of a fast food restaurant is kind of contingent on the wage. If you had to pay somebody $15 an hour, there's not going to be the one guy who doesn't know how to do anything that takes out the trash at the McDonald's I go to, and we'll probably go to right after this podcast. But there's a guy who doesn't work in the kitchen at all, and he cleans up everything, and I see that. I don't think he'd have a job if he had to be paid $15 an hour. So there are people who are low skilled that will be priced out of markets if you raise the minimum wage. That's inevitable. So I don't think it's very populist because you're prioritizing certain workers over others. And this is, I think, a problem that is huge in populism. How people can say something's good for workers, yet it's good for some workers, not others. And that's kind of an issue I have with a lot of these kinds of leftist thoughts, but they also relate to, populism in general and centrally planning the economy. So that's kind of a route I wanted to go down, but I don't know how much thoughts you have on distinguishing that or breaking down, that collectivist aspect of populism.
Well, I feel kind of caught off guard with all that, but I'll try to give you as good a response as I can. So I guess first question is, how do you derive policies from populism? And, I guess what I would say is people have the right to be heard. People have the right to get their voice out there, and people have the right to live in societies in which their needs, their feelings, their desires are met. And no, not everyone's going to agree on X, Y, or Z, but I don't think that invalidates populism, and I don't think that invalidates democracy, because if we were, it kind of goes back again to another philosophical question we often bring up, are people rational or not? I think we could live in a society in which people they can come to disagreements, but we can minimize the maybe gap between those disagreements. Our current system doesn't really allow for much of an opposition. You're either a Democrat or a Republican. So in other words, you're either, I guess you could say, center left or center right if you want to use the traditional spectrum. But that's, that doesn't allow for certain grievances to be addressed. And part of that is the fault of the state, which, I want to move past the state eventually, just like you do. And, So I guess what I'm trying to say, to be a populist doesn't mean I don't think that you're not acknowledging the differences among the workers, but what you're saying is, I'm going to fight for your well-being. Now we can disagree on that, what that means exactly, but as long as we acknowledge that the working class needs certain things to function, I think that would make you or anyone a populist.
Okay, I got your point there, and I think I had one main question up till the last sentence, which was kind of like to broaden out my point. I think I was making the argument that certain policies are always going to benefit and hurt people who we consider workers differently. So I think I'm trying to kind of separate the blob that we call workers. And you are acknowledging they're different, but I think there are very narrow ways where almost every policy will hurt some and privilege others, to where I think it's hard to claim that a certain policy helps the workers, because a lot of times policies will be pointed to as helping workers on average, right? So that's like the minimum wage argument. Well, if we can push up a bunch of workers' wages, then that helps workers. But it's like, well, we're also kind of pricing out a small group of people who are very low skilled, right? So even if you can make this kind of mathematic allocation of like, well, we're going to raise the wages of 6 million people if we do this, but we priced out 150,000 people, so now they will have to they won't be able to get a formal job. Then I think that's a problem, because you have to still. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think populism its basic premise is something that I'm okay with, right? But I think as an actual applicable framework to use as some kind of guiding star, I think runs into problems very quickly, because I don't think workers are actually that similar on average. And then you have to kind of figure out what point you think a worker tops out at, right? Because somebody can be making $50,000 a year, and in certain areas of the country, that's way better than other areas of the country. And some people who make $50,000 a year are going to feel working class, and some aren't. So then we're talking about people who are not elites, but they make more than people who make the minimum wage. And then we have to kind of pick between them, and we're picking winners and losers instead of letting people live their own lives. I think that's where I become hesitant. But I do agree with your general point that you made like 10 minutes ago, right after I ranted, where I am kind of springing that upon you. But these were the thoughts running through my mind when I listened to populists talk for like an hour and a half. So these are kind of, I guess, abstract. Well, not abstract, but they're kind of political philosophy points about populism in general. Now, what you said at the end about how we populists should be able to agree that certain workers need base needs. Well, I'm sitting here thinking that I'm a populist because I champion policies that empower the individual instead of empowering the elites. And I agree that people should have base needs, and that'd be good if they did. But I still don't agree with you on, I guess, the non-aggression. I don't agree that justifies breaking the non-aggression principle. So I would still call myself a populist because I agree on the elites versus worker front, but I don't think that means we can steal from people. So so to some extent, I don't agree with you, because you'd say universal healthcare is a populist position, and I wouldn't. So are those reconcilable, or should I have to abandon the term? Because based on like the Wikipedia definition, I think I fall under it. So I threw that at you, but I don't know. Off the top of your head, I think it's interesting to think about. You don't have to say you're not held to what you say here either, because I'm just spitting out thoughts. So if you say something that you could track back on it, that's perfectly fine. I'm just kind of trying to think about populism more than I have before, because the most I usually hear about it is NPR or Ben Shapiro criticizing it, right? So that's why I'm just kind of feeling it out.
Okay. Well, yeah, you are just throwing a lot at me. So I, forgive me if I don't have a as articulate or a satisfying answer, but I'll give it my best shot. Well, no, I think, I would say that you and I are both populists, but there's, as you kind of said at the beginning of the episode, we agree generally or on social issues, but we're very different on economic issues. So, I think we can both be populists, but there are just, excuse me, there are substantial disagreements, but that's fine. I don't mind that. I enjoy our conversations, and I think, if you and I were political players as such, which we're not, but if we were, I would not hesitate to work with you on things such as legalizing marijuana, such as legalizing, I don't know, prostitution. There are all kinds of things that you and I agree on, that I would not hesitate to work with you on if either of us were in a position of power. And I'm reminded, this might go against my case, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm reminded, the late mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell explained his meeting with Vladimir Lenin, and he mentioned how Lenin had said something about, or they were just talking generally about the Russian Revolution and what it meant. And I remember that Russell said, Lenin said something about the poor peasants get together and hang the rich peasants. And I'm reminded of that. I'm reminded of that because of what you said, how, in your view, some workers are going to be enfranchised and some workers are going to be disenfranchised. And I guess all I would say to that is, I think there's a way to finesse this sort of thing. I mean, there's a way to go about politics in which everybody is given as much opportunity as possible, and everyone is given, everyone has their basic needs, and everyone so we're not going to have, and I said this I think in the last episode, no one's going to be 100% equal all the time every day. And that might be something where I disagree with a lot, that some fellow leftists of mine would disagree with me on. But there are natural inequalities, and we're never going to have a perfect equal utopia. But I still think that we can. I'm just not sure I agree with you on your specific examples, but I think that we can create a world which preserves individual freedom and liberty, but also looks after the common good.
Got it. Yeah, and I think that was a...
Sorry, I don't feel like that was a very good answer, but...
Well, no, I'm putting you on the spot and throwing a lot at you. And I do want to make one observation more on the topic we just had, and then I just want to transition to like another thought I jotted down earlier, and then maybe we can move to wrap it up. Now, so I use the minimum wage example as a situation where it's workers versus workers, and the better workers empower themselves. One thing that I find relatively interesting is you'll see a lot of people that are left-wing populists. They're very pro $15 minimum wage on average. It seems like a lot of them are for that, and it seems like a lot of them are very for union. But the union system in general seems like the very opposite of the increase in the minimum wage situation, because one reason, and I can say this because we're at least 40 minutes into recording this, so there's no way that my employer, if they were following my political thoughts, would get 40 minutes into this podcast, because I don't think they'd be that interested in seeing if they can get rid of me. But one point why I'm to some extent dissatisfied with my job is we almost have a pseudo union in the sense that's just the way the promotions work is similar to a union at my company. So at a union, a lot of times, you have like a very high floor, right? So you have to do something you have a lot of worker protection so people can't get fired willy-nilly, and there's very systemized processes. And in general, what happens is unions really raise the floor. So the bad workers, it's actually really hard to get rid of them. And then the good workers, it can be hard for them to move up. So, which is kind of the opposite of the minimum wage situation, where you disenfranchise the lowest people because now it's harder for them to get in the door because they have to make at least $15 an hour of marginal productivity. And I just find it interesting that usually pro unions and pro $15 minimum wage line up so much when, in a weird way, unions privilege the worst employees at a company that's unionized, and the minimum wage helps the ones that won't get fired because the minimum wage went up. Now, it would make sense if you were thinking that they should be done in tandem, because then you're raising the floor and the ceiling, and maybe that would work in some extent. But you'd think unions just keep people from getting hired into them. That could be a problem. But this is just an observation I'm making when I was thinking about populism when I watched that video, and that's just kind of retreading what you already responded to. So I'm going to move on to another point. And it was when you mentioned the article being titled, like, "Is right-wing populism just fascism?" And so there are a lot of words that invoke the same feeling in me, but we have very technical differences between them. And fascism is one of those words that I feel like when I hear it, it strikes me the same as authoritarianism, right? But fascism is the right-wing brand of authoritarianism. So because fascism is authoritarianism plus right-wing, right? Is that an okay way of calling something fascist? Well, then isn't left-wing populism just authoritarianism? Because it's the authoritarianism without the right-wing part that makes it the fascist government. Because when I'm listening to populists, it's like, yeah, you guys are fighting for the worker, but you're using government to impose more rules and regulations on other people. And it adds all these things that inhibit like my freedom to contract my labor at the way I want to, because now I have to operate under your rules, right? Or an employer who wants to hire somebody now has to take into consideration a slew of things that the state imposes on them. So to me, all those things, any state regulation, sounds like authoritarianism. And I don't think that's a term that the left-wing populists would want. So I guess I'm going to give you a chance to either say, well, maybe by that definition, we are authoritarianism, but everything's authoritarianism. That's not anarchy, so that's okay. I guess that'd be a reasonable position to take. Or you can defy the word authoritarianism all you want because it sounds bad. So you can push back against the word choice. I'm giving you those two options. But yeah, I think you might have to own that term. So let me know what you think, because I know you should be hesitant to do that because it sounds all icky. But I think that's kind of inevitable when you use the state like that. So what are your thoughts on that observation?
Yeah, I felt pretty confident when we started this podcast, and now I feel much less confident as it goes on. No, I reject anyone who would call me authoritarian. I reject that outright because I'm not, what Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler, what did they have in common? Or like, I mean, I know neither of us likes that that graph political spectrum, but if you look at it, they're both very high, like I think almost equivalent on the authoritarian end, but of course, according to that scale, at least, Stalin was extremely on the far left economically, excuse me, and Hitler was like, I don't know, center right economically, I think. I only bring this up because, yeah, you can have right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism, and I think in some ways, even though Nathan J. Robinson in that article is criticizing the horseshoe theory, there is a truth to it in the sense that right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism have a lot in common. And we but no, I reject the idea that I'm authoritarian, because that an authoritarian is anti-democratic, and I am. Stalin was not a Democrat, a small D Democrat. Stalin didn't think, well, we should talk to the workers, see what they have to say. We'll make committees. We'll really think about this, and I want to make sure I'm doing the people's will. No, he did what he wanted to, no matter what, and he killed a lot of people in the process. No, that is absolutely abysmal, and I reject that outright. and I know you could make the argument, well, isn't democracy just the authoritarianism of the mob or whatever? But I just disagree with that analysis of things. Now, I always bring up Slavoj Žižek all the time just because he's such an interesting philosopher. But I suppose I could slip into the Slavoj Žižekian answer. I could give both answers just to, I don't know, provoke you or something. Slavoj Žižek, I suppose, would say something, and he considers himself like a Marxist or a communist or whatever. He would say something like, well, there are certain examples of situations where not taking a stand or not using force is fundamentally immoral. So, I do reject being called an authoritarian, but I guess I could see why you might come to that conclusion, and I can, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No. Okay. So I want to go on a mini rant, and it's not because I think you're that wrong. It's because it's a pet peeve in general about political discourse that this is bringing out of me. So one thing that I have a problem with is people, in my mind, not owning up to trade-offs, right? So what I said about the minimum wage example, I find it hard for like a rational person to say, you're right, a $15 minimum wage wouldn't disenfranchise a bunch of people who have very low skills. It's like, no, you can imagine a lot of people that you've seen working that for $7.25, it's very easy to imagine some of them would lose their job. Like, that's inevitable, but you should just own it and say, but here's what we're getting for it, and here's how we can make it work. So now, I don't see why authoritarianism inherently has to be the power of one person ruling over everybody. I feel like that's closer to maybe tyranny, if you want to do the examples. So one of my issues is with democracy is for some reason we make the argument that if you can get a majority of people to agree on something, it's not rule by authority. But I think what makes authoritarian rule authoritarian is that you are imposing it on people who don't want that rule imposed on them. So I did not consent in any way. I didn't sign the Constitution. Nobody's outright asked me to consent to be governed. I guess if they let me say I didn't consent, they would probably forcefully take me from my home and send me to Alaska, maybe, or not Alaska, Antarctica, because I don't believe that there's a formal government there. I guess what I'm getting at here is I didn't consent to this interaction. So no matter how many people you have agree on it, it doesn't really matter if I said no. So even if you say, well, you're being unreasonable, it's like, sure, that's very possible. I'm a very unreasonable, stubborn, thick-headed person, and I'm aware of that. But that doesn't make it not authoritarian if a bunch of people decide to vote away something of mine, or like some of my possessions, or some of my income, or some of my rights. I think that's inherently definitionally authoritarianism. Now, for some reason, no. So here's what I think you should say. What I think you should say is democracy is authoritarianism, but here's why I still like democracy. And I like democracy because I feel like a lot of people should have the voice, and if a majority of people agree on something, it should be a rule in that society, right? I think that's what you should say. But for you to pretend like other people aren't forcing their views on me, it feels disingenuous, right? I think you should own up to the fact that people have voted away my money, my income, and my rights year over year. Well, since before I was born, because I don't know how you can argue that hasn't happened. And if I tried to resist, they used the monopoly on government to hurt me, right? So I find it hard to say that they're not willing to use state apparatus of force on me as an individual. I feel like that's like definitionally authoritarianism. Now, you can say authoritarianism is justified if it's done in democratic fashion. That's an argument a lot of people historically have made. But by shying away from the authoritarian part, I don't feel like you're owning up to the negative side on the pros and cons analysis of democracy. And I'm not trying to paint your motives bad, because nobody really admits democracy is authoritarian. Like, a lot of people in the mainstream won't own up to it. But I'm not seeing the logical argument of how they aren't going to use force on me because they voted a certain way. So maybe you want to draw a definitional divide, but then I don't feel like you can call it freedom if I don't agree to something that people forced on me. So if that's not authoritarianism, it's clearly not freedom. So what is it?
Okay, I feel like we've really gotten sidetracked. I'm not sure how to go forward here. No, I mean, I if I accept your definition of authoritarianism, then I think I don't see how anything, almost anything in our lives isn't in some way authoritarian. I mean, and I'm sorry, like I don't mean to. I'm not trying to be, thin-skinned here, but I do feel somewhat like you're painting my motives badly. And no, I don't accept it, and I don't accept that definition of authoritarianism. I don't accept that, because what I see as authoritarianism is a government. I guess maybe this is where I'm a bit confused. You're very anti-government as an ANCAP, but now you're saying, well, if a majority votes to take away, I don't know, my right to a machete, then that's authoritarian. But the way I view authoritarianism is government is when people use the government to dictate our lives. So Stalin and Hitler were both authoritarians because they were both using the government to tell people how to live, what to say, what to do. They were killing mass amounts of people who disagreed with them. I just because, like, even if you disagree with what a majority does and you say that, well, they're doing that by force, I just don't think that's authoritarianism. That's, again, so yeah.
I think the nuance I guess I'm trying to make is because I'm not trying to indict your motive. I'm not trying to compare people who think a state should exist to Hitler. I think what I'm trying to say is Hitler's and Stalin are extreme examples of authoritarians, right? But then they use that state apparatus to do the worst things humanly imaginable. So I don't think doing the worst things imaginable with that power is what is required to be an authoritarian. I think pushing your power, even if your views are admirable on other people, is authoritarian. So I would, you could, I guess I think it'd be okay to call our democracy a moderate authoritarianism, but it's like the penalties if I don't abide by their rules are very, very dismal for me as an individual. Like I mean, if I decided to resist certain things, they'd lock me up and throw me in a cage. So that I guess that's why I think authoritarianism is a great word. Now, luckily for me, I'm not pursuing jobs that would put me in the crosshairs of the government. I, as a burly 23-year-old man, am not a prostitute. And I'm not a prostitute, in the 60s or 70s where maybe they were very strict on them and were catching them and throwing them in prison. And then those people's livelihoods were taken away because, the government, who are empowered by the people, said that this is not a job that we're allowing our citizens to have. Right. So although I think you can say, well, obviously Hitler and Stalin and Mao are all these extreme ones dictating your life, I think every rule and regulation backed with the threat of force or fine or violence, all those are a lower form of authoritarianism. Now, I just don't have a better word for this type of, this type of danger that we're put in if we resist the rules of our overlords. But I'm not trying to indict your motive, because I think everybody generally agrees with you. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is me having my own Freudian, to Freudian, like analyze my own motives. I always find myself trying to figure out where I'm going wrong. And my big sticking point is the non-aggression principle, right? So I'm just triggered by things that people view as moral goods when I'm seeing all this violence behind it. And I'm just looking back at the curtain, staring at that while people argue about the good they're going to do without force. And I'm just stuck on the force. So I guess what I was trying to say is, why don't people acknowledge the force that's inherent to their views and then reconcile that with their beliefs? Because I don't think it's that hard to say, hey, I just don't think these regulations are that bad. I don't think we're harming people that much. You do have to abide by them. We are going to fine you if you don't abide by it. We're going to say your contract's not legitimate if you don't abide by it. And we are going to use our government granted, or people granted the government with authorities to nullify your contracts. They don't go by our beliefs. And it's like, I think that's authoritarianism, but you can reconcile the phrase. You can reconcile with it saying, but we're using it for good, unlike Stalin and Hitler. So I don't know. I think I understand I derailed it. It's just somewhere I had to go when I listened to populists talk for an hour and a half on prep material, and I apologize. This is a moral failing on my part as a podcast co-host. But I had to, as the ANCAP, I think it's a trope that I take the conversation there at some point. Since I'm the one who degraded our podcast, taking it to this low of lows, I will allow you to get in the last word, and I will not respond to it. That is me. That's my mea culpa, right? This is my come to Jesus moment, and how I will be a sacrificial lamb. So you can get your last words in. You can say everything I just said was completely wrong and had no validity. And once you're ready, you can put yourself on mute, and I'll close out the show, and then I'll apologize again after. So let's do that. Hit it. Go for it.
Okay. So I guess there are two kind of main points I want to get out there. I mean, I do think you're dead wrong. And imagine. Well, Noam Chomsky gives this example. I mean, he says Noam Chomsky is an anarchist. I think technically an anarcho-syndicalist, and he says he's an anarchist because any authority, any force, does need to be questioned. It's the responsibility of the person who's the person who's acting in a position of authority to justify their position of authority. And he gives the example, if his 3-year-old granddaughter is about to walk into the middle of a street, and someone, there's a car about to zoom by, if he grabs her and saves her from getting run over, that's authority. Now he can easily justify that, and I don't think most people would say no, you can't justify doing that. But that would be Noam Chomsky acting as a position of authority over his 3-year-old granddaughter. And so I guess I would just bring up the point that I do think that in certain instances you can justify authority, and I don't think I wish it might be nice if we lived in a world where that never had to happen, but unfortunately it does. And in some ways parents have to be authoritarian. Some ways in some ways you have to draw a line and say, no, we're not going to do this. And if you try to do it, we're going to have to stop you somehow. It was you could say it was authoritarian for the Allied powers to go after Nazi Germany. Now, Nazi Germany would have infringed what you call the non-aggression principle. But what about all the civilians that were killed by the Allied forces? That was authoritarian. Was that justified? I think it probably was. And I always bring up Abraham Lincoln. What he did to stop slavery and to create as much as possible something of an integrated society. Was that authoritarian? Probably. And I guess I'll just end with this point. I think a lot, being a radical leftist like myself, I think a lot about the Russian Revolution, and the question, well, where did it go wrong? I can admire people such as Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, in the sense that the Russian Empire was collapsing. It was an abysmal state. It was bordering on fascism. It was very possible that Russia could have become fascist. There was an attempt that the February Revolution, of course, tried to form a parliamentary democracy, but that was very quickly failing. And so the Bolsheviks came in with the October Revolution and said, well, okay, this situation is awful. We're going to see what we can do to fix it. Now, I'm not excusing all the Stalinist atrocities. I'm not saying I am necessarily a Leninist or a Trotskyist, but I don't think we can just say, well, that just because not everyone agreed with Lenin, therefore he was a horrible authoritarian monster, and we can't take away anything from his example.
Great. Well, I'm going to hold up my end of the bargain, and I'm not going to bring us down another rabbit hole. Although there was something you said that's really random that I do want to. I'll bounce off you after the call just for food for thought, and it's not a rant. It's just like 3 sentences probably. But on that note, I hope you appreciated our. Actually, this was once again. I feel like I said this a few episodes ago, but I feel like this was a very on-brand episode of Beyond Talking Points, where we started off having a jumping off point and we commentated on it for like 20 minutes. And then I was like, well, now that we had a pleasant discussion, let's just send this like straight to hell. Let's just throw that straight in the gutter. And let's just argue about our priors. But I think in the end, in a meta way, it ties together because we were talking about where left and right populists can agree. And we still, despite having a knockdown, drag out fight about authoritarianism, if we were both legislators, we'd pass so much stuff like immediately on day one, because we'd be able to be like, okay, where do you agree? This isn't that hard. It's like, okay, legalize marijuana, okay, and then I'd be like, okay, and obviously legalize meth, and then we look at each other, and then you'd be like, okay, we'll see on that. But so I hope you guys enjoyed. This was episode 20. That's a milestone of sorts. I don't know what we're going to talk about next week. We have plenty of things that we still need to get around to that we've kind of been putting off for a while. You can find the video version of this podcast where you can see both of us having our first. Last episode you had your haircut, but I just got my first haircut since quarantine several months ago. So I finally am rocking short hair. So you can see that video version on YouTube. If you search The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points, you should be able to pull it up. And you can find us on all your normal podcatchers like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So once again, thank you for listening, and signing off, it's Matt and Matthew.